April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m. The world witnessed a horror at Chernobyl, but declassified Soviet documents reveal we didn't just dodge a disaster, we escaped an apocalypse. The difference between the catastrophe we know and the apocalypse we nearly faced. 15 degrees. In our timeline, when Reactor 4 exploded, its massive concrete biological shield was ejected at a precise angle. This 2,000-ton lid, thrown skyward by the force of the explosion, directed most of the radioactive material upward. That angle was pure chance, a roll of atomic dice that determined the fate of Europe. But what if that shield had shifted just 15 degrees? Recently declassified KGB documents reveal how close we came to this reality. The Soviet Union's own physics models showed that this slight variation would have created a pressure wave that pulverized more of the reactor's nuclear fuel into particles. Nuclear physics is unforgiving, explains Dr. Elena Karpova, former assistant to Dr. Valery Legasov. People think of alternate histories as big changes. What if Hitler won the war? What if Kennedy wasn't assassinated? Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest variations. 15 degrees, that's all it would have taken. In our timeline, about 30% of Reactor 4's nuclear fuel was released into the atmosphere. But in this darker timeline, that 15-degree shift would have ejected 60% of the reactor's radioactive core. The difference? A cascade of events that would reshape the end of the Cold War, transform military doctrine, and create what historians now call the environmental warfare age. This is the story of how close we came to losing Europe. A story pieced together from declassified documents, surviving testimonies, and decades of scientific analysis. A reminder that sometimes history balances on a mathematical knife edge. The butterfly effect of our 15-degree shift manifests within seconds. As the heavier concrete shield crashes at a different angle, it creates a pressure wave that pulverizes more of the reactor's nuclear fuel into a fine radioactive mist. But it's what happens next that transforms disaster into catastrophe. 1:27 a.m. The first firefighters arrive at Reactor 4. In our timeline, these men became tragic heroes, many sacrificing their lives to contain the disaster. But in this darker version, they encounter radiation levels nearly twice what was historically recorded. The difference is astronomical, explains nuclear physicist Dr. Viktor Petrov. In our timeline, the firefighters had minutes to work before receiving lethal doses. In this scenario, they would have had seconds. The increased radiation levels would have incapacitated them almost immediately. 1:45 a.m. Without effective firefighting intervention, the intense heat and radiation begin affecting Reactor 3. This is where our timeline and the alternate history diverge dramatically. The increased heat from the pulverized fuel creates what nuclear engineers call a thermal cascade. The proximity of Reactor 3 to Reactor 4 created a vulnerability that Soviet engineers had identified years earlier, reveals Dr. Elena Kovalenko, analyzing recently declassified facility documents. In our timeline, quick firefighting action prevented this vulnerability from being exposed, but with higher radiation levels preventing effective emergency response. 2:15 a.m. The thermal cascade triggers a series of secondary events. Reactor 3's cooling systems begin to fail. Emergency shutdown protocols are compromised. The structural integrity of the entire complex starts deteriorating. Radiation levels continue climbing exponentially. By 3 a.m., what was originally a single reactor disaster transforms into something unprecedented, a dual reactor crisis. The initial 15-degree shift has now created conditions that even Soviet disaster protocols never contemplated. But the true horror of this alternate timeline reveals itself when the weather report comes in. A low-pressure system is moving toward the facility, the same system that in our timeline carried radiation toward Scandinavia, but now with twice the radioactive material in the air. This weather pattern becomes nothing less than an atmospheric delivery system for radioactive contamination. The early morning hours of April 26th reveal how quickly a localized nuclear disaster can transform into a regional catastrophe. By 6 a.m., the implications of our 15-degree shift have created what nuclear strategist Herman Kahn would call a cascading failure sequence. The Soviet emergency response system was designed to handle what they called predictable catastrophes, explains Dr. Elena Rothschild. But this alternative scenario creates something their entire institutional framework couldn't process, a disaster that grows exponentially rather than linearly. Three critical systems begin to fail simultaneously. First, information control. Radiation levels too high for monitoring equipment. Communication systems compromised by radiation. Local authorities making autonomous decisions as central control breaks down. Second, physical containment. Traditional firefighting methods prove futile. Emergency protocols rendered obsolete by dual reactor crisis. Contamination spreading faster than response teams can track. Third, environmental factors. What makes this timeline particularly catastrophic, notes meteorologist Dr. Viktor Petrov, is how weather patterns amplify the disaster. The same low-pressure system that in our timeline carried radiation towards Scandinavia now encounters twice the radioactive material, creating what we call a toxic multiplication effect. But the Soviet system's fatal flaw reveals itself on May 1st. Despite radiation levels now reaching 400 times normal background readings, local party officials proceed with plans for the annual May Day parade in Kiev. This decision transforms a nuclear disaster into a societal catastrophe, explains Dr. Sarah Chen. In our timeline, the May Day parade exposed thousands to dangerous radiation levels. But in this scenario, with contamination levels doubled and a second reactor now compromised, we're looking at exposure rates that create immediate health effects in the celebration crowds. By the end of the first week, the crisis has expanded beyond any containment scenario. Radiation zones 3 times larger than historically recorded, secondary contamination spreading through water systems, agricultural regions becoming immediately unsuitable for farming, mass population centers exposed to critical radiation levels. A recently declassified KGB assessment from this period reveals a chilling conclusion. The situation has evolved beyond all existing parameters for crisis management. We are now operating in what can only be described as uncharted territory. When Western environmental monitoring stations first detected the elevated radiation levels, they faced an unprecedented challenge. Their existing nuclear disaster protocols assumed they'd have days, possibly weeks, to respond. Instead, they had hours. What happens next, explains Dr. James Burke, is one of history's most remarkable examples of crisis-driven innovation. The West realizes they're not just fighting a nuclear disaster, they're fighting an invisible invasion that recognizes no borders, no treaties, and no conventional military responses. The first breakthrough comes from an unlikely collaboration between American satellite engineers and Soviet nuclear physicists who had defected years earlier. Within 72 hours, they create what becomes known as ATLAS, Atmospheric Toxic Level Analysis System. ATLAS revolutionizes how we understand radiation spread, notes Dr. Elena Kovalenko. Imagine having a 3-dimensional map of death itself. Every wind pattern, every rain cloud, every temperature variation becomes visible in terms of its potential to carry radioactive particles. But ATLAS is just the beginning. As radiation levels continue climbing, conventional protective equipment proves inadequate. This crisis demands something entirely new. The hermit suit, high-energy radiation, military intervention technology, represents a quantum leap in environmental protection. Unlike traditional radiation suits, Hermit integrates real-time ATLAS data to create what engineers call predictive protection. The suit knows you're entering danger before you do. Yet the most profound technological leap comes from necessity's darkest corner. With radiation levels in some areas too high for even hermit-suited teams, the West accelerates development of radiation area drones, RADs. These aren't just remote-controlled vehicles, explains Dr. Viktor Petrov. RADs represent the first truly autonomous radiation mapping and response system. They can enter zones that would kill humans in seconds, mapping contamination patterns and conducting emergency operations without risking human lives. Together, these 3 technologies, ATLAS, Hermit, and RADs, create what military historians now call the environmental warfare triad. But more significantly, They represent humanity's first true response to a threat that can't be bombed, sanctioned, or deterred through conventional means. What emerges from the ashes of conventional military doctrine is something entirely unprecedented: environmental warfare. As one NATO strategist noted in a recently declassified memo, we're not just watching the Soviet Union collapse, we're witnessing the birth of an entirely new form of power projection. Traditional warfare focused on destroying enemy capabilities, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, military theorist. Environmental warfare inverts this completely. Success isn't measured in what you can destroy, but in what you can protect. Territory isn't conquered, it's salvaged. Command structure. Traditional military hierarchies dissolve. Scientists become frontline commanders. Environmental data drives tactical decisions. Real-time radiation mapping replaces conventional reconnaissance. Consider this fundamental shift, notes General James Morrison, former NATO commander. In conventional warfare, a commanding officer might order troops to take a hill. In environmental warfare, Atlas data showing radiation patterns determines not just how you take the hill, but whether you can approach it at all. Combat units evolution, NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical, teams become primary assault forces. Traditional infantry transforms into environmental response units. Air forces repurposed for contamination control. Artillery units converted to delivery systems for decontamination materials. But perhaps the most profound transformation comes in how military objectives themselves are redefined. The goal is no longer to defeat an enemy force, but to contain an environmental threat that could destroy both sides equally. This creates what we call hostile cooperation, explains Dr. Elena Volkov. Imagine coordinating with enemy forces, not because you want to, but because the alternative is mutual environmental destruction. The radiation doesn't care about your ideology. The implications reshape the entire concept of military power. Environmental warfare capability becomes the new measure of superpower status. Traditional nuclear deterrence becomes obsolete. Military alliances form around environmental protection capacity. Combat readiness redefined in terms of environmental response capability. By June 1986, NATO has effectively transformed from a military alliance into what one analyst calls an environmental protection force with military capabilities. The Soviet Union, still clinging to conventional military doctrine, finds itself fighting a type of war never prepared for, cannot win. The Soviet system wasn't just facing environmental catastrophe, it was experiencing what nuclear strategist Herman Kahn called a cascading legitimacy crisis. Every hour that Moscow delayed decisive action became an hour where local authorities began questioning the entire chain of command. What makes this collapse unique, explains Dr. Elena Rothschild, is how Western environmental warfare capability strips away the Soviet Union's most crucial tool, information control. You can't maintain the fiction of containment when foreign atlas systems are mapping your failure in real time. The breakdown occurs across three critical dimensions simultaneously. 1. Military chain of command. By early June, Soviet military discipline faces an unprecedented crisis, notes Dr. Viktor Petrov. When Atlas data reveals that Moscow has been lying about radiation levels, local commanders face an impossible choice: follow orders that amount to death sentences or protect their troops. The dissolution accelerates. Battalion commanders begin refusing deployment orders. Local units start making autonomous evacuation decisions. Military equipment increasingly diverted to unofficial evacuation efforts. Command structure fragments along radiation zone boundaries. 2. Civil authority collapse. What's fascinating, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, is how radiation patterns redraw administrative boundaries. Traditional oblast borders become meaningless when Atlas shows some areas are uninhabitable. Local officials start forming what we call survival coalitions, informal networks based on radiation safe zones rather than political boundaries. But it's the third dimension that proves fatal: the collapse of information control. Western RAD drones document mass graves Moscow tried to hide. Atlas systems reveal attempted cover-ups of secondary radiation leaks. Hermit-suited teams discover evacuation zones are far larger than reported. Local radiation data contradicts central government pronouncements. The Soviet system was built on centralized control, notes Dr. James Burke. But you can't centralize a response to radiation that spreads chaotically. Every local official who acts independently to save their population becomes another crack in the system. Environmental warfare doesn't just defeat Soviet military power, it makes their entire governance model obsolete. The Soviet system wasn't just facing environmental catastrophe, it was experiencing what nuclear strategist Herman Kahn called a cascading legitimacy crisis. Every hour that Moscow delayed decisive action became an hour where local authorities began questioning the entire chain of command. What makes this collapse unique, explains Dr. Elena Rothschild, is how Western environmental warfare capability strips away the Soviet Union's most crucial tool, information control. You can't maintain the fiction of containment when foreign atlas systems are mapping your failure in real time. The breakdown occurs across three critical dimensions simultaneously. Military chain of command. By early June, Soviet military discipline faces an unprecedented crisis, notes Dr. Viktor Petrov. When Atlas data reveals that Moscow has been lying about radiation levels, local commanders face an impossible choice: follow orders that amount to death sentences or protect their troops. The dissolution accelerates. Battalion commanders begin refusing deployment orders. Local units start making autonomous evacuation decisions. Military equipment increasingly diverted to unofficial evacuation efforts. Command structure fragments along radiation zone boundaries. Civil authority collapse. What's fascinating, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, is how radiation patterns redraw administrative boundaries. Traditional oblast borders become meaningless when Atlas shows some areas are uninhabitable. Local officials start forming what we call survival coalitions, informal networks based on radiation safe zones rather than political boundaries. But it's the third dimension that proves fatal: the collapse of information control. Western RAD drones document mass graves Moscow tried to hide. Atlas systems reveal attempted cover-ups of secondary radiation leaks. Hermit-suited teams discover evacuation zones are far larger than reported. Local radiation data contradicts central government pronouncements. The Soviet system was built on centralized control, notes Dr. James Burke. But you can't centralize a response to radiation that spreads chaotically. Every local official who acts independently to save their population becomes another crack in the system. Environmental warfare doesn't just defeat Soviet military power, it makes their entire governance model obsolete. The collapse of Soviet authority creates something unprecedented in human history: a power vacuum defined not by military might or economic strength, but by environmental warfare capability. Nations aren't just divided by ideology anymore. They're stratified by their ability to manage radioactive contamination. What emerges, explains Dr. Elena Volkov, is a new global hierarchy based on technological sophistication. Imagine the Cold War redrawn not by nuclear arsenals, but by who can protect their population from invisible death. First-tier powers, nations with full Atlas coverage, Hermit suit production capability, advanced RAD drone fleets, and complete environmental warfare doctrine. These nations, notes Dr. James Burke, don't just protect themselves, they effectively control the fate of regions without similar capabilities. It's colonialism reinvented through environmental protection. Second-tier nations, partial environmental monitoring capability, limited containment technology, dependent on first-tier support, struggling to adapt Soviet-era equipment. But it's the third tier that reveals the true transformation of power, explains Dr. Sarah Chen. These regions become effectively dependent territories, not through military occupation, but through their inability to manage environmental threats independently. This technological hierarchy creates new forms of influence. Control of radiation data becomes more valuable than military intelligence. Environmental protection capability replaces nuclear deterrence. Scientific expertise outweighs traditional military strength, and technology transfer becomes the new form of alliance building. The most fascinating aspect, notes Dr. Viktor Petrov, is how this hierarchy reshapes the very concept of sovereignty. When your ability to govern territory territory depends entirely on environmental warfare capability, traditional concepts of national independence become almost meaningless. By August 1986, the international system has fundamentally transformed. Western environmental warfare units effectively control former Soviet territory. Regional powers emerge based on technological adaptation capability. Traditional military alliances reshape around environmental protection. New forms of technological interdependence create unprecedented political relationships. To understand how societies adapt to life under constant radioactive threat, let's examine what becomes known as rad-adaptive communities, settlements where every aspect of human existence reorganizes around environmental survival technology. What emerges in these communities, explains sociologist Dr. Elena Volkov, is nothing less than a new form of human civilization. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to your personal radiation monitor's daily briefing. Imagine checking contamination levels before checking the weather. These settlements develop three distinct organizational patterns. The fortress communities, former military installations transform into radiation-hardened population centers. Notes urban specialist Dr. James Chen. Soviet-era bunkers become the foundations for new types of cities, where every building is designed around environmental protection systems. Life in these communities revolves around technological ritual. Morning radiation level checks determine daily movement patterns. Atlas data defines safe zones for children's activities. Community gatherings sync with decontamination cycles. Even religious services incorporate radiation monitoring. But what's truly fascinating, explains anthropologist Dr. Sarah Miller, is how these communities develop new forms of social hierarchy. Technical expertise becomes the new nobility. The person who maintains your radiation scrubbers becomes more important than any political leader. By late 1986, these communities have developed unique characteristics. Education systems focused on environmental survival skills, new forms of social status based on technical capability, modified cultural practices that accommodate radiation monitoring, transformed family structures oriented around technological protection. These aren't just survivors, notes Dr. Viktor Petrov. They're the pioneers of a new form of human society, one where technology isn't just a tool for living, but the fundamental basis of civilization itself. The psychological transformation of societies under constant radiation threat reveals something profound about human adaptability and the hidden costs of survival under perpetual technological monitoring. What emerges, explains Dr. Maria Kuznetsov, leading researcher in radiation psychology, is an entirely new framework of human consciousness we call rad consciousness, a fundamental rewiring of how humans perceive safety, time, and even reality itself. This transformation manifests across three critical domains. Threat perception. The human brain, notes neuropsychologist Dr. Viktor Petrov, evolves to process invisible threats through technological extension. Children born into rad-adaptive communities develop what we call technological omniscience, the ability to conceptualize radiation dangers through atlas data as if it were a natural sense. Parent-child relationships undergo radical transformation. Emotional bonding becomes intertwined with technological protection. Children develop security attachment to environmental monitoring systems. Parental anxiety focuses on radiation levels rather than traditional dangers. Family rituals reorganize around technological safety protocols. But perhaps most fascinating, explains social psychologist Dr. Sarah Chen, is the emergence of what we call technical empathy, the ability to understand and respond to others' radiation safety needs as instinctively as we once responded to emotional cues. Novel psychological conditions emerge: radiation rejection syndrome, pathological avoidance of human contact due to contamination fears, atlas dependency disorder, inability to feel safe without constant technological monitoring, gradient anxiety, panic attacks triggered by changes in radiation readings, technical separation, anxiety, severe distress when disconnected from monitoring systems. What we're really witnessing, concludes Dr. Elena Rothschild, is the emergence of a new type of human consciousness, one that processes technological data as naturally as our ancestors processed sensory input. The question isn't whether this transformation is permanent, it's how it will reshape human evolution itself. The story of this darker Chernobyl timeline isn't just about what might have been, it's about what still could be. Every day, our civilization balances on similar technological knife edges, where small variables can cascade into catastrophic consequences. Consider this. Today, there are 440 nuclear reactors operating worldwide. Each one represents both our mastery over atomic power and our vulnerability to technological hubris. The 15-degree shift that transformed our alternative 1986 might seem like ancient history, but similar critical variables exist in our present technology. What makes this alternative history so crucial to understand, explains Dr. Elena Rothschild, is how it reveals the razor's edge between technological achievement and technological apocalypse. We're not just looking at what might have happened, we're seeing the blueprint for what we must prevent. The lessons of this darker timeline crystallize into three critical insights. Our greatest technological achievements can become our greatest vulnerabilities. The difference between disaster and apocalypse often comes down to seemingly minor variables. The true measure of technological advancement isn't just what we can build, but what we can control. Today, we face our own potential 15-degree moments. AI systems approaching critical complexity thresholds, climate tipping points with cascading effects, biotechnology advancing faster than our ability to regulate it, cybersecurity systems protecting increasingly vital infrastructure. The real question, poses Dr. Viktor Petrov, isn't whether we'll face our own 15-degree moment. The question is, will we recognize it in time? History isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding what could have happened and what still might. Each technological advance creates new precipices. Each innovation opens new vulnerabilities. So we ask you, what's our generation's version of that 15-degree shift? What technological precipice are we standing on right now, unaware of how close we are to the edge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to explore more alternative histories that reshape our understanding of technology and society, subscribe for new scenarios every week, because understanding how history could have gone differently is crucial to ensuring we make the right choices going forward. History isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding what could have happened and what still might. The question isn't whether we'll face our own 15-degree moment. The question is, will we recognize it in time?